The auction block stood in the blazing Texas sun like a monument to human cruelty. It was September 1887, and while most of America was celebrating progress and prosperity, three small figures huddled together on that wooden platform, their fate about to be decided by the highest bidder. What happened next would shake the very foundations of how America treated its most vulnerable children, and turn one furious rancher into the most unlikely hero the state of Texas had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over the rolling hills of East Texas, clinging to the pine forests and cotton fields like spirits reluctant to surrender to the harsh reality of another sweltering day. In the small town of Marshall, population barely 3,000 souls, the weekly livestock auction was already drawing crowds of ranchers, farmers, and merchants from across Harrison County. But today's auction would feature more than cattle and horses today. Human beings would be sold like property. And not a single person in that crowd seemed to find anything wrong with it. Standing at the edge of the town square, watching the early preparations with eyes that burned like forged coals, was Jacob Samuel Morrison. At 34 years old, Jake Morrison commanded respect wherever he went in East Texas. His weathered hands told the story of a man who had built his fortune through sweat, determination, and an uncompromising sense of justice that had made him as many enemies as friends. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across 8,000 acres of prime Texas land, employing nearly 200 men and producing some of the finest cattle in the state. But Jake Morrison's wealth hadn't come easily or without cost. He'd been orphaned himself at 12 when a fever took both his parents within a week, leaving him to fend for himself on the unforgiving Texas frontier. He'd learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who protected the innocent and those who preyed upon them. Today, he'd come to town expecting to buy breeding stock for his expanding operation. Instead, he was about to witness something that would change the course of his life forever. The crowds were already gathering around the auction platform when Jake spotted her, a woman in her 40s with sharp, calculating eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted into an expression of bitter resentment. Constance Whitfield wore the black dress of mourning, but there was nothing sorrowful about her demeanor as she supervised the unloading of a covered wagon. Jake had heard whispers about Constance Whitfield around town, none of them flattering. She was the kind of woman who measured everything in terms of profit and loss, who saw opportunity in other people's misfortune. What emerged from that wagon made Jake's blood run cold. Three young girls, ranging in age from perhaps 8 to 14, were being herded toward the auction platform like livestock. Their clothes were little more than patched rags, their faces gaunt with hunger and streaked with the kind of grime that spoke of weeks without proper care. But it was their eyes that hit Jake like a physical blow, wide with terror and confusion, yet somehow still holding a spark of defiance that reminded him painfully of his own childhood struggles. The eldest girl, a rail-thin creature with auburn hair that caught the morning sunlight despite its tangled condition, kept her thin arms wrapped protectively around her two younger sisters. She couldn't have been more than 14, but she carried herself with the fierce determination of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. Her green eyes swept the growing crowd with the wariness of a wild animal surrounded by predators, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. The middle sister appeared to be around 11, with dark brown hair and features that would have been pretty if not for the haunted expression that aged her beyond her years. She pressed close to her older sister, her small hands clutching at the older girl's torn dress, as if letting go would mean being swept away by forces too terrible to comprehend. Her lips moved constantly in what Jake realized were silent prayers, the desperate supplications of a child who had learned that God was her only possible salvation. The youngest couldn't have been more than 8 years old, a tiny wisp of a thing. with blonde curls that had been roughly chopped short and blue eyes that seemed too large for her small face. She hadn't spoken a word since emerging from the wagon, but she clung to her sisters with the desperate intensity of someone who understood, even at her tender age, that they were all she had left in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. Jake found himself moving closer to the platform, his jaw clenched with barely controlled rage as he began to piece together what was happening. The town's auctioneer, a pompous man named Bertram Cully, who made his living selling everything from farm equipment to human beings, was examining the girls like livestock, checking their teeth and muscles with the casual efficiency of someone evaluating cattle. "Fine specimens, all three," Cully announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who could sell sand to desert dwellers. The Whitfield sisters, recently orphaned when their parents died in that terrible mill accident over in Jefferson. Their aunt, Mrs. Constance Whitfield, has generously agreed to find them suitable employment to prevent them from becoming a burden on the county. Employment. The word was a mockery, a thin veneer of respectability painted over what everyone present understood to be human trafficking. Jake had seen enough of the world to know what kinds of employment awaited young girls sold at auction. Some would end up as unpaid servants in wealthy households, worked to exhaustion and discarded when they outlived their usefulness. Others would face far worse fates in the saloons and brothels that dotted the Texas frontier, their innocence sold to the highest bidder and their lives destroyed before they'd barely begun. The crowd that had gathered around the platform was a mix of respectable townspeople and others whose very presence made Jake's skin crawl. He recognized several local businessmen, including the owner of the town's largest general store and a banker who was known for his charitable work with orphans. But scattered among them were faces that belonged in the shadows, men whose eyes lingered too long on the frightened girls, whose whispered conversations carried undertones that made Jake's hands itch for his gun. Constance Whitfield stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice carrying the rehearsed sincerity of someone who had practiced this speech in front of a mirror. "These poor children have been such a burden since their parents' tragic death," she began, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that remained suspiciously dry. "I've done everything I could to care for them, but a widow woman of modest means can only do so much. I'm hoping to find them positions with good Christian families who can provide them with proper guidance and opportunities for useful employment." Jake felt his stomach turn at the woman's performance. He'd made some inquiries around town while waiting for the auction to begin, and the picture that emerged of Constance Whitfield was far different from the grieving aunt she pretended to be. According to several reliable sources, she had inherited a substantial sum when her brother died in that mill accident, enough to care for his daughters comfortably for years. But Constance had other plans for that money, plans that apparently didn't include feeding or clothing 3 inconvenient orphans. The bidding began with what Cully euphemistically called employment contracts, legal documents that would bind the girls to their purchasers for periods ranging from 7 to 10 years. The terms were slavery in all but name, granting their new employers complete control over every aspect of their lives, while providing only the most basic food and shelter in return. The girls would have no legal recourse, no means of escape, no hope of freedom until they reached adulthood, if they survived that long dot as the first bids were called out. Jake watched the eldest sister's face transform from fear to something approaching desperation. She understood what was happening, understood that she and her sisters were about to be separated and sold to different buyers. Her green eyes found his across the crowd, and in that brief moment of contact, Jake saw a plea so desperate, so heartbreaking, that it cut through his soul like a blade. The bidding was brisk and brutal. A local merchant offered $50 for the eldest girl, citing her obvious intelligence and potential value as a housekeeper. A saloon owner from the rough side of town countered with $75, his intentions clear to anyone with eyes to see. The middle sister drew interest from a factory owner who claimed he needed workers for his textile operation, while the youngest attracted the attention of a well-dressed couple who spoke in hushed tones about the value of training them. Young, Jake found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the hunger and desperation that had driven him to sleep in barns and steal food just to survive. He remembered the kindness of the few people who had helped him, the ranch foreman who had given him his first honest job, the elderly woman who had taught him to read and write. Most of all, he remembered the promise he had made to himself during those dark years, that if he ever had the power to help children in similar circumstances, he would not hesitate to act. The auctioneer was preparing to finalize the first sale when Jake stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd like thunder. $1,000, he called out, his words causing a sudden hush to fall over the gathering. For all three girls, together. The silence that followed was deafening. $1,000 was more money than most of the people present would see in 5 years, an almost unimaginable sum for what Cully had been marketing as employment contracts. Every head in the crowd turned toward Jake, some recognizing the wealthy rancher, others simply staring in shock at the man who had just made such an outrageous bid. Constance Whitfield's eyes lit up with undisguised greed. This was far more money than she had dared to hope for, enough to fund her planned move to San Francisco, and the life of leisure she felt she deserved. She stepped forward eagerly, but Jake held up a hand to stop her before she could speak. "I have conditions," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his words taken seriously. "The contracts will be structured as apprenticeships, not indentures. The girls will receive proper education, adequate food and clothing, and medical care when needed. They will not be separated, and they will have the right to terminate their employment when they reach the age of 18. The crowd erupted in murmurs of confusion and outrage. What Jake was proposing was unheard of, treating purchased children as human beings rather than property, providing them with rights and protections that went far beyond what the law required. Several of the other bidders began to protest, arguing that such terms would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system of child labor that many local businesses depended upon. But Constance Whitfield cared nothing for precedents or protests. She saw only the largest payday of her life standing before her, offering more money than she had ever imagined possible. "Sold," she declared before the auctioneer could even respond, her voice carrying across the square like a victory cry. As the legal paperwork was hastily prepared and money changed hands, Jake found himself studying the three sisters more closely. The eldest girl was watching him with a mixture of hope and suspicion, clearly struggling to understand why anyone would pay such an enormous sum for their contracts if he didn't intend to exploit them somehow. The middle sister had stopped praying long enough to stare at him in wonder, while the youngest continued to cling to her siblings with the desperate intensity of someone who had learned not to trust in adult promises. The crowd began to disperse, many people grumbling about the disruption of normal business, others simply curious about what the mysterious rancher planned to do with his expensive purchases. Jake ignored them all, focusing instead on the three girls who were about to become his responsibility. He approached them slowly, recognizing the feral wariness in their eyes, the way they pressed together like frightened animals. "My name is Jacob Morrison," he said gently, crouching down to bring himself closer to their eye level. "I know you're scared, and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I want you to know that you're safe now. No one is going to hurt you, and no one is going to separate you from each other." The eldest sister spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse but steady. "What do you want from us, mister? Why did you pay so much money if you don't want ... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood what she was trying to say. "What I want," Jake said carefully, "is to give you something that was taken from me when I was about your age. I want to give you a chance to choose what kind of life you want to live. But first, I want to give you something even more important. I want to give you hope." As Jake loaded the three sisters into his wagon for the journey to his ranch, he had no idea that this moment would mark the beginning of something unprecedented in American history. The simple act of treating orphan children as human beings, rather than property, would ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined, ultimately changing not just the lives of three frightened girls, but the entire conversation about child welfare in post-Civil War America. The sun was climbing higher. As they left Marshall behind, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as they rolled toward an uncertain but suddenly hopeful future. Behind them, the auction block stood empty in the town square, but Jake Morrison carried with him the weight of a promise he had made to three children who had lost everything. A promise that would soon shock an entire nation and redefine what it meant to be family in the American West. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon wheels churned up clouds of red dust as they rolled away from Marshall, leaving behind the jeers and whispers of a town that couldn't understand why a man would spend a fortune to free three children from a fate they considered perfectly normal. Jake Morrison kept his eyes fixed on the winding dirt road ahead, but his attention was focused on the three sisters huddled together in the wagon bed behind him, their silence more deafening than any screams could have been. The eldest girl, Jake, realized with a start that he didn't even know their names, yet sat rigid as a statue, her thin arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters. Every few minutes, her green eyes would dart toward the tree line on either side of the road, as if calculating whether they could survive in the East Texas wilderness better than whatever awaited them at their destination. Jake recognized that look. He'd worn it himself 22 years ago, when survival had meant never trusting anyone completely and always having an escape plan ready. The September heat was already becoming oppressive, and Jake could see beads of sweat forming on the girls' foreheads despite the shade provided by the wagon's canvas cover. He pulled the team to a halt beside a clear creek that meandered through a grove of towering pine trees, their shadows providing blessed relief from the climbing sun. "We'll rest here for a spell," Jake announced, climbing down from the driver's seat with movements that were deliberately slow and non-threatening. "The horses need water, and I expect you girls could use some refreshment too." The three sisters remained motionless in the wagon bed, watching him with the wary intensity of wild animals that had learned to associate human approach with pain. Jake felt his heart clench as he recognized the depth of their mistrust. How many adults had failed these children? How many promises had been broken? How many hands that should have protected them had instead brought harm? "It's all right," Jake said gently, extending his hand toward the eldest girl. "The water's safe to drink, and there's no one else around for miles. You can speak freely here." After a long moment of internal struggle that played out clearly across her expressive face, the oldest sister finally spoke. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Whitfield. This is my sister Mary Catherine, we call her Katie, and this is little Eleanor. We call her Ellie." Jake nodded solemnly, treating the introduction with the gravity it deserved. "It's an honor to meet you, Sarah. Katie. Ellie." He directed each name toward the appropriate girl, noticing how Ellie's eyes widened slightly when he spoke to her. Directly, "I'm Jake Morrison, and I want you to know something important right from the start. You're not my property, despite what those papers say. You're my guests, and you'll be treated with respect and kindness for as long as you're under my roof." Katie spoke for the first time since leaving Marshall, her voice carrying a tremor that spoke of barely controlled fear. "What's going to happen to us, Mr. Morrison? Aunt Constance said we'd have to work to earn our keep, but she also said—" She trailed off, unable to voice the darker implications that had been whispered around their aunt's house during the weeks following their parents' death. Jake knelt beside the wagon, bringing himself to eye level with the three girls. "What's going to happen is this. You're going to come to my ranch, where you'll have your own rooms, 3 meals a day, and the chance to attend school with my foreman's children. If you want to help around the ranch, there will be age-appropriate chores available, but there'll be real work that teaches useful skills, not drudgery designed to break your spirits. Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why? People don't spend $1,000 on children out of kindness. There has to be something you want from us. The directness of her question impressed Jake, even as it broke his heart. This 14-year-old girl had learned lessons about human nature that no child should ever have to master. You're right to be suspicious, Sarah. In my experience, adults who claim to help children usually want something in return. But here's what I want from you 3. I want you to grow up healthy and strong and smart. I want you to have choices about your futures that most orphans never get. And someday, when you're older and settled in lives of your own choosing, I want you to remember that not all adults are predators. The creek gurgled peacefully beside them as the girls processed this unprecedented offer. Jake could see the internal battle playing out in Sarah's expression, the desperate desire to believe warring with the hard-won wisdom that had kept her and her sisters alive in a hostile world. How do we know you're telling the truth? Katie asked, her small voice carrying an adult's wariness. How do we know this isn't just another lie? Jake stood slowly, walking to the back of the wagon where he kept his travel supplies. He pulled out a worn leather journal and a pencil, returning to sit on a fallen log where all 3 girls could see him clearly. I'm going to tell you something that I've never told another living soul, he said, opening the journal to a page covered with his careful handwriting. When I was 12 years old, my parents died in a fever epidemic that swept through this part of Texas. I had no relatives, no money, nowhere to go. For 3 years, I lived like a wild animal, sleeping in barns when I could find them, stealing food when I had to, working for scraps when anyone would hire me. He turned the journal toward them, revealing pages filled with dates, locations, and brief descriptions of his childhood experiences. I started keeping this record when I learned to write, because I never wanted to forget what it felt like to be completely alone and powerless. Every kindness someone showed me is written down here, and every cruelty too. Sarah leaned forward despite herself, drawn by the neat columns of writing that represented one man's attempt to make sense of a childhood marked by loss and struggle. What happened to you? How did you end up owning a ranch? When I was 15, I was caught stealing bread from a general store in Jefferson. The sheriff was going to send me to the county work farm, which was basically a prison for children. But the store owner, a man named William Patterson, offered to take responsibility for me instead. He gave me a job, taught me about business, and treated me like the son he never had. Jake's voice grew softer as he continued. Mr. Patterson died 5 years later, and he left me his store and a small amount of money. I used that stake to buy land and cattle, and I worked 18-hour days for the next 15 years to build what I have now. But I never forgot what it felt like to be hungry and scared and alone. Ellie, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up in a voice so quiet they had to strain to hear her. Did Mr. Patterson have children he could have left his store to instead of you? The question revealed a sophistication that Jake found both impressive and heartbreaking. Even at 8 years old, Ellie understood that kindness toward strangers often came at a cost to family members. He had a daughter, Jake admitted. She lived back east and hadn't spoken to him in years because she disapproved of his business partnerships with Mexican traders. When she heard about his will, she contested it in court, claiming I had influenced him while he was ill. What happened? Sarah asked, clearly invested in the story despite her attempts to maintain emotional distance. The judge ruled in my favor because Mr. Patterson had written several letters explaining his decision. But the whole experience taught me something important about the difference between charity and justice, Mr. Patterson. didn't help me because he felt sorry for me. He helped me because he believed I deserved a chance to prove what I could accomplish with the right opportunities. Jake closed the journal and tucked it back into his travel bag. That's what I'm offering you three. Not charity that makes you dependent on my goodwill, but justice that recognizes your right to have the same opportunities as any other children in Texas. The philosophical distinction was perhaps too complex for the younger girls to fully grasp, but Sarah understood immediately. Her entire posture changed as the weight of constant vigilance began to lift from her shoulders. For the first time since their parents' death, someone was offering them something without demanding payment in return. "If we come to your ranch," she said carefully, "and if we don't like it there, can we leave?" Jake considered the question seriously before answering. "Legally, you're bound by those contracts until you turn 18. But I give you my word that if any of you truly wants to leave, I'll help you find a safe situation that you prefer. I won't keep anyone against their will." The rest of the journey to Morrison Ranch passed in a tentative conversation that gradually revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen the Whitfield family. Their father, Thomas Whitfield, had been a skilled millwright who specialized in designing and building the complex machinery that powered East Texas lumber operations. Their mother, Margaret, had been a teacher before her marriage, known throughout Jefferson for her work with immigrant children who struggled with English. The mill accident that killed both parents had been no accident at all. According to Sarah's careful account, Thomas had discovered evidence that the mill owner was using substandard materials in critical safety equipment, cutting costs at the expense of worker safety. When he threatened to report the violations to territorial authorities, he and his wife had been murdered in what was made to look like an industrial accident. "Daddy had hidden copies of all the documents in our house," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her father's courage. "But after the funerals, Aunt Constance threw everything away before we could stop her. She said dwelling on the past wouldn't bring them back." Jake felt his jaw clench with anger as he began to understand the full scope of the injustice that had been perpetrated against these children. They had lost not only their parents, but also their father's attempt to protect other workers from the same fate. Constance Whitfield hadn't just stolen their inheritance, she had participated in covering up a double murder. "Your father sounds like a man of great courage," Jake said carefully. "Standing up for what's right when it costs you something takes a special kind of strength. He always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they accomplished when things were easy, but how they behaved when doing the right thing came with a price," Katie added, her voice filled with pride and grief in equal measure. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Morrison Ranch finally came into view. 8,000 acres of rolling grassland stretched out before them, dotted with clusters of cattle and crossed by meandering streams that caught the golden afternoon light. The main house sat on a low hill overlooking the entire spread, a sprawling, two-story structure built from local timber and limestone that spoke of prosperity, earned through honest work. But it was the activity surrounding the main house that truly captured the girls' attention. Dozens of people moved about the ranch compound with the purposeful efficiency of a community that had found its rhythm. Children played in a fenced yard near what appeared to be a schoolhouse, their laughter carrying across the distance like music. Women tended vegetable gardens that clearly provided fresh food for the entire community, while men worked with horses and cattle in corrals that were designed for both efficiency and animal welfare. "It looks like a town," Ellie breathed, speaking louder than she had all day. "In a way, it is," Jake agreed. "About 40 families live and work here year-round, plus seasonal hands during roundup and cattle drives. We've got our own school, a church, a general store, and even a doctor who visits twice a month." Sarah was studying the scene with the calculating eyes of someone who had learned to assess potential dangers and opportunities. "Where would we live? With one of the families?" Jake's answer would have surprised anyone who had witnessed the morning's auction. "You'll have your own house," he said simply. "It's not large, just 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room, but it's yours. I hired a woman named Mrs. Elena Rodriguez to help you get settled and to serve as your chaperone until you're old enough to manage completely on your own." The 3 sisters exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shared disbelief. The idea of having their own house, their own space where they could make decisions and live without constant supervision, was so far beyond their expectations that they struggled to process it. As the wagon rolled through the main gate of Morrison Ranch, Jake found himself thinking about the choice he had made that morning. $1,000 represented more money than many families would see in a decade, and he could have used it to expand his herd or improve his facilities. Instead, he had chosen to invest it in something that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Possibility that 3 children might grow up to become the kind of adults the world desperately needed. What Jake Morrison didn't yet realize was that his simple act of treating orphaned children as human beings rather than property was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything America thought it knew about childhood, family, and the obligations of wealth toward those who had nothing. The 3 frightened girls in the back of his wagon were about to become the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple across the entire nation, changing not just their own lives, but the lives of countless other children who would follow in their footsteps. The sun was setting behind the ranch house as they pulled up to the front porch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to promise better days ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new discoveries, but tonight, for the first time in months, Sarah, Caddy, and Ellie Whitfield would fall asleep knowing they were safe, protected, and valued for who they were rather than what they could provide to others. Dawn broke over Morrison Ranch with the gentle persistence of hope itself, painting the Texas sky in watercolor shades of rose and gold. For the first time in 3 months, Sarah Whitfield awakened not to the harsh commands of her Aunt Constance or the growling of her empty stomach, but to the soft murmur of voices speaking Spanish and what she gradually realized was a kitchen there. Kitchen just beyond her bedroom door. The small house that Jake Morrison had assigned to them was unlike anything the girls had experienced even before their parents' deaths. Each sister had her own bedroom, complete with a real bed frame, clean linens, and a window that looked out over the ranch's sprawling pastures. Sarah's room even contained a small desk with paper, ink, and pens, luxuries that spoke to Jake's understanding that education required more than just sitting in a schoolhouse. The aroma of fresh tortillas and coffee drew Sarah from her bed, where she had spent much of the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the trap to reveal itself. In her experience, kindness always came with hidden costs, and the greater the apparent generosity, the more devastating the eventual price. But as she padded barefoot toward the kitchen, wearing a clean nightgown that had been left folded on her dresser the previous evening, she found herself cautiously allowing hope to take root in her heart. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez proved to be a revelation. A woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life filled with joy despite its hardships. She moved around the kitchen with the confident efficiency of someone who found genuine pleasure in caring for others. Her husband, Elena explained in accented but fluent English, was Jake's head vaquero, responsible for training both horses and the Mexican cowboys, who formed the backbone of the ranch's cattle operation. "Senator Morrison, he told me you would be hungry," Elena said with a warm smile that reached her dark eyes. "Growing girls need proper food, not the scraps that woman was giving you." The breakfast that followed was a feast that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Fresh eggs from the ranch's chicken coop, thick slices of bacon from their own smokehouse, biscuits that were still warm from the oven, and butter that had been churned that very morning. But more important than the abundance of food was the atmosphere Elena created, one of genuine care and respect that treated each girl as an individual worthy of attention and consideration. Katie, who had always been the family peacemaker, was the first to warm to Elena's motherly presence. Soon she was chattering about her hopes of learning to cook, her memories of helping their mother in their kitchen back in Jefferson, and her dreams of someday running a restaurant that would serve the best food in all of Texas. Elena listened with the kind of focused attention that made Katie feel that her aspirations mattered, that her future was worth planning for. Even little Ellie, who had barely spoken since their parents' deaths, began to emerge from her protective shell under Elena's patient encouragement. The older woman seemed to understand instinctively that Ellie needed space to process her grief at her own pace, offering comfort without pressure and including her in conversations without demanding responses. Sarah, however, remained wary. The 14-year-old had appointed herself guardian of her sister's welfare, and she couldn't allow herself to relax until she better understood the true nature of their situation. When Elena suggested a tour of the ranch, Sarah agreed not out of curiosity but from a strategic need to understand their environment and identify potential escape routes if they became necessary. What she discovered during that morning tour challenged every assumption she had formed about how wealthy people lived and how they treated those who depended on them for survival. The Morrison Ranch wasn't just a cattle operation. It was a carefully designed community that seemed to operate according to principles Sarah had never encountered in the harsh realities of post-Civil War Texas. The schoolhouse, their first stop, was a substantial building that rivaled the finest educational facilities in Marshall or Jefferson. Inside, 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 sat at proper desks, working with books, slates, and supplies that would have cost more than most families earned in a year. The teacher, Miss Rebecca Sterling, was a young woman who had traveled all the way from Boston to take the position, drawn by Jake's offer of a salary that was double what she could earn in established Eastern schools. Mr. Morrison believes that education is the greatest gift we can give children, Miss Sterling explained as she showed them through the classroom. Every child on this ranch attends school until they're 16, regardless of their parents' position or financial circumstances. We teach reading, writing, mathematics, history, geography, and practical skills like bookkeeping and animal husbandry. Sarah felt her breath catch as she realized the implications of what she was seeing. Education had been her parents' highest priority, and her father had often spoken of his dreams of sending all 3 daughters to college, an ambition that had died with him in that mill accident. Here, incredibly, that dream might still be possible. The ranch's medical facilities proved equally impressive. Dr. Samuel Harrison, a Civil War veteran who had studied at Harvard Medical School before coming west, maintained a clinic that served not only the ranch community but also neighboring farms and the small towns within a day's ride. The doctor's presence meant that the chronic ailments that plagued most frontier families, everything from broken bones to childhood diseases, could be treated with professional care rather than folk remedies and desperate prayers. Jake Morrison lost his parents to a fever that could have been treated if proper medical care had been available, Dr. Harrison explained to Sarah during their visit to the clinic. He's determined that no child under his protection will die from preventable illness. But it was their visit to the ranch's chapel that revealed the most surprising aspect of Jake's philosophy. Rather than imposing a single religious tradition on his diverse community, he had created a space that could accommodate multiple faiths. Protestant services were held on Sunday mornings, Catholic Mass on Sunday afternoons, and the building was available for Jewish observances when needed. A small collection of religious texts in English, Spanish, and Hebrew sat on a shelf near the altar, available for anyone seeking spiritual guidance. Mr. Morrison says that a man's relationship with God is between him and the Almighty, explained Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who visited the ranch monthly. He provides the space and the opportunity for worship, but he doesn't dictate the form it should take. This religious tolerance was revolutionary in a part of Texas where denominational conflicts often turned violent, where Catholics and Protestants viewed each other with suspicion, and where Jewish families faced outright persecution. By creating a space where different faiths could coexist peacefully, Jake had built something that challenged the religious bigotry that plagued much of American society. The tour continued to the ranch's other facilities, a general store that sold goods at cost to ranch families, a workshop where skilled craftsmen taught young men trades that would serve them throughout their lives, and a library that contained more than 500 books, a collection that rivaled those found in major cities. Each stop revealed another layer of Jake's vision for creating a community that provided its members with opportunities for growth and advancement rather than simply extracting labor from them. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to understand that Morrison Ranch represented something unprecedented in her experience, a place where wealth was used to lift others up rather than to exploit them. Jake Morrison had created what amounted to a small utopian society, one that operated according to principles of fairness, education, and mutual respect that seemed almost too good to be true. The revelation that would truly shock her came during their visit to the ranch's administrative offices, housed in a building that also contained Jake's private study. Sarah had expected to find the typical setup of a wealthy rancher's headquarters: ledgers or tracking profits and losses, maps showing land acquisitions, correspondence focused on business dealings and political connections. Instead, she discovered something that left her speechless. The walls of Jake's study were covered with maps of Texas and the surrounding territories, but these weren't marked with property boundaries or cattle routes. They were covered with pins and notes tracking the locations of orphanages, children's homes, and families known to be caring for parentless children. Filing cabinets contained correspondence with officials throughout the region, all focused on child welfare and protection. Mr. Morrison has been working for 5 years to establish a network of people committed to improving conditions for orphaned children, explained James Patterson, Jake's business manager and the son of the man who had saved Jake from his own childhood poverty. He's provided funding for orphanages in 6 counties, helped establish schools in communities that had none, and personally intervened in dozens of cases where children were being mistreated. The scope of Jake's charitable work was staggering. He had quietly revolutionized childcare throughout East Texas, using his wealth and influence to create opportunities for hundreds of children who would otherwise have faced lives of poverty and exploitation. The 3 Whitfield sisters weren't his first rescue. They were simply the most dramatic example of his commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Why? Sarah asked, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. Why does he do all this? James Patterson smiled with the kind of affection reserved for family members. Because he remembers what it feels like to be powerless and afraid. Because he believes that every child deserves the chance to discover what they're capable of achieving. And because he has the resources to make a difference, which he believes creates an obligation to act. As they walked back toward their house for the midday meal, Sarah felt the last of her defensive walls beginning to crumble. Jake Morrison wasn't a predator disguising his intentions behind false kindness. He was a man who had transformed his own painful experiences into a mission of mercy that was quietly changing the lives of countless children throughout Texas. The implications of this discovery were overwhelming. For the first time since their parents' deaths, Sarah began to believe that she and her sisters might actually have a future worth anticipating. More than that, she began to understand that they had been rescued not just from immediate danger, but from a lifetime of limitations that their poverty and orphan status would have imposed upon them. That afternoon, as Alina helped them plan their first visits to the schoolhouse and introduced them to other ranch children who would become their classmates and friends, Sarah finally allowed herself to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Perhaps Katie really could learn to cook well enough to run her own restaurant. Perhaps Ellie could overcome her trauma and rediscover the joy that had characterized her personality before their world collapsed. Perhaps Sarah herself could receive the education that would allow her to honor her father's memory by continuing his work protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The transformation that was beginning in the hearts of 3 orphaned girls would soon ripple outward in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Jake Morrison's radical experiment in treating children as human beings rather than property was about to capture the attention of reformers, politicians, and ordinary citizens throughout America, sparking a national conversation about child welfare that would ultimately change the lives of millions. But for now, on this perfect September afternoon in 1887, Sarah, Katie, and Ellie Whitfield were simply 3 sisters who had found safety, hope, and the promise of a future that their parents would have been proud to see them embrace. 3 weeks had passed since the Whitfield sisters arrived at Morrison Ranch, and their transformation was already remarkable to behold. Sarah had thrown herself into her studies with the desperate intensity of someone making up for lost time, devouring books on mathematics, literature, and history with an appetite that impressed even Miss Sterling. Katie had discovered a natural talent in Elena's kitchen, her innate understanding of flavors and cooking techniques suggesting she might indeed fulfill her dream of running her own restaurant someday. Little Ellie had begun speaking again, her voice growing stronger each day as she formed friendships with the other ranch children and slowly emerged from the protective shell that trauma had built around her heart. But the peace of Morrison Ranch was about to be shattered by forces that had been gathering strength since the day Jake Morrison disrupted the human auction in Marshall. Word of his unprecedented act, paying a fortune to free 3 orphan girls, and then treating them as family rather than property, had spread throughout East Texas like wildfire, carrying different meanings to different audiences and sparking reactions that ranged from admiration to outrage. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October morning when dust clouds on the eastern horizon announced the approach of multiple riders moving at speed toward the ranch. Jake was reviewing breeding records in his study when James Patterson burst through the door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "Jake, we've got visitors coming," James announced, moving quickly to the window that overlooked the main approach to the ranch. "At least 20 riders, and they're not here for a friendly social call." Jake joined him at the window, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the military precision of the approaching group's formation. At their head rode a man whose bearing and uniform marked him as a county sheriff, while the others appeared to be a mixture of local officials, businessmen, and what Jake's instincts told him were hired guns disguised as legitimate deputies. "Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood," Jake identified grimly, recognizing the leader of the group. "Marshall's new sheriff, appointed last month after the previous one mysteriously resigned. I hear he's got strong opinions about maintaining proper social order." What Jake didn't yet know was that Sheriff Blackwood had been specifically recruited for his position by a consortium of East Texas businessmen who were deeply disturbed by the precedent Jake's rescue of the Whitfield sisters had established. If word spread that children could be treated as human beings rather than sources of cheap labor, it could undermine an economic system that depended on exploitation of the vulnerable. The group that rode into Morrison Ranch that morning represented more than just local law enforcement. They were the advance guard of a counter-revolution designed to restore the natural order that Jake's radical kindness had dared to challenge. Leading them was not just Sheriff Blackwood, but also Marcus Henley, the mill owner whose safety violations had led to the deaths of Thomas and Margaret Whitfield; Judge Horace Pemberton, whose courts had consistently ruled in favor of business interests over workers' rights; and Dr. Ezra Thornfield, a physician whose medical opinions for hire had covered up numerous accidents in East Texas industries. Confrontation that followed would test everything Jake had built and force him to defend principles that most of American society wasn't ready to accept. As the riders assembled in the ranch's main courtyard, their presence drew curious onlookers from throughout the community. Ranch families emerged from their homes and workplaces, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. "Jake Morrison." Sheriff Blackwood's voice carried across the courtyard with the authority of law backed by force. "I'm here on official business regarding 3 minor children who are reportedly being held on your property under questionable circumstances." Jake emerged from his house with the measured calm of a man who had expected this confrontation and prepared for it accordingly. Behind him came James Patterson, carrying a leather satchel filled with legal documents, while Dr. Harrison positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings and serve as a credible witness to whatever transpired. "Sheriff Blackwood," Jake replied evenly, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "You're welcome at Morrison Ranch, as are all representatives of lawful authority. What specific concerns bring you here today?" Blackwood dismounted with theatrical flair, clearly playing to an audience that extended beyond the ranch residents to include several men. Jake didn't recognize reporters. He realized who had been brought along to document whatever was about to unfold. "I have reports," Blackwood announced loudly, "that you are harboring 3 orphan girls under circumstances that violate both territorial law and basic moral decency. Furthermore, I have sworn statements alleging that these children are being subjected to inappropriate influences that undermine proper Christian values and social stability." The accusations were carefully crafted to exploit the prejudices and fears of 1887 Texas society. By suggesting that Jake's treatment of the girls was both illegal and immoral, Blackwood was positioning himself as a defender of traditional values against dangerous progressive ideas. "I'd be interested to hear the specific nature of these allegations," Jake replied, his tone remaining carefully neutral despite the anger building within him. "And I'd like to know who has made such serious charges." Marcus Henley stepped forward, his presence confirming Jake's suspicion that this confrontation was about more than child welfare. "I've made those charges, Morrison. As a concerned citizen and a Christian man, I cannot stand by while innocent children are exposed to the radical ideas and inappropriate associations that characterize your so-called community." The accusation of inappropriate associations was a thinly veiled reference to the ranch's diverse population and Jake's policy of religious tolerance. In a Texas still recovering from civil war and struggling with questions of racial equality, Jake's creation of an integrated community where Mexican, Anglo, and even a few African American families lived and worked together as equals was seen by many as dangerously subversive. Furthermore, Judge Pemberton added, consulting a legal document with great ceremony, "There are questions about the validity of the contracts under which these children were acquired. Mrs. Constance Whitfield has contacted my office expressing concerns that she may have been defrauded in the transaction." Jake felt a chill of recognition as he understood the full scope of the legal trap that was being constructed around him. Constance Whitfield had undoubtedly been promised a share of any money recovered if the adoption contracts could be invalidated, giving her a financial incentive to cooperate with the consortium seeking to destroy the precedent Jake had established. "I have all relevant legal documents in my possession," James Patterson interjected, stepping forward with the satchel of papers. "The contracts were executed in full compliance with territorial law, witnessed by multiple parties and recorded with the appropriate county officials." "That may be," Dr. Thornfield said with an oily smile, "but recent medical examinations of children from similar circumstances have revealed evidence of mistreatment that calls into question the wisdom of placing orphans in unconventional household arrangements." The medical angle was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their attack. Dr. Thornfield's reputation for producing medical opinions that supported whatever his clients needed gave his statements weight in legal proceedings, regardless of their actual medical validity. It was at this critical moment that Sarah Whitfield made a decision that would transform the entire confrontation. She had been watching the proceedings from the schoolhouse window, her intelligence immediately grasping the threat that these men represented, not just to her family's newfound security, but to the entire community that had welcomed them without consulting anyone. Sarah walked directly into the courtyard, her spine straight and her head held high with a dignity that commanded attention from everyone present. Behind her came Katie and Ellie, their presence a visible reminder that real children were at the center of this political and legal battle. "Sheriff Blackwood," Sarah said, her clear voice cutting through the adults' arguments like a blade. "I am Sarah Whitfield, and these are my sisters Katie and Ellie. We are the children you're discussing, and I believe we have the right to speak for ourselves." The boldness of her intervention sent shockwaves through both groups. In 1887 Texas, children, especially orphaned girls, were expected to remain silent while adults made decisions about their fate. For Sarah to assert her right to participate in the conversation was unprecedented and deeply unsettling to men who were accustomed to exercising unquestioned authority over those they considered their social inferiors. "Young lady," Judge Pemberton began condescendingly, "children your age are not competent to understand the legal complexities." "I understand perfectly," Sarah interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand that you represent the same people who murdered our parents when they tried to expose safety violations that were killing workers. I understand that you want to destroy Mr. Morrison because his kindness threatens an economic system that depends on exploiting children and families who have no power to protect themselves." The accusations hit their targets like physical blows. Marcus Henley's face flushed red with anger and what might have been guilt, while Judge Pemberton sputtered with outrage at being publicly challenged by a 14-year-old girl. "That's enough," Sheriff Blackwood barked, his hand moving toward his weapon. "I won't stand here and listen to a child make slanderous accusations against respected members of our community." But Sarah wasn't finished. The weeks of safety and education at Morrison Ranch had restored her confidence and given her the knowledge she needed to fight back against the forces that had destroyed her family. "You want to talk about inappropriate influences?" she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Let me tell you about inappropriate influences. It's inappropriate for mill owners to use equipment they know is dangerous because it saves them money. It's inappropriate for judges to rule against workers' families when they seek justice for preventable deaths. It's inappropriate for sheriffs to serve the interests of wealthy men instead of protecting the innocent." The crowd of ranch residents who had gathered to witness the confrontation began to murmur their agreement. Many of them had their own experiences with the kind of corruption and exploitation that Sarah was describing, and her courage in speaking truth to power resonated with their own struggles for dignity and justice. Katie stepped forward to support her sister, her voice trembling but determined. "Mr. Morrison gave us something that no one else would hope. He treats us like we matter, like our futures are worth investing in. If that's inappropriate, then I'm proud to be inappropriate." Even little Ellie found her voice, speaking words that would be quoted in newspapers across America in the coming weeks. "Before we came here, grown-ups only talked to us when they wanted something from us. Mr. Morrison talks to us because he cares what we think and feel. That's not wrong, that's what grown-ups should do." The simple truth of the child's observation cut through all the legal complexities and political maneuvering to expose the fundamental moral issue at stake. Here were three children who had experienced both exploitation and kindness, speaking from direct experience about which approach had served their best interests. Dr. Harrison chose that moment to step forward with medical records that would demolish Dr. Thornfield's implied accusations. "I've been treating these children since their arrival," he announced. "They've gained weight, their chronic malnutrition has been corrected, and their psychological health has improved dramatically. Any medical professional who examines them will find evidence of excellent care, not mistreatment." The confrontation might have escalated into violence at that point, but Jake Morrison demonstrated the wisdom that had built his success by offering his opponents a face-saving exit strategy. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you're welcome to inspect our facilities, interview our residents, and examine our records. If you find any evidence of wrongdoing or any child who wishes to leave, I'll cooperate fully with whatever legal remedies you deem appropriate. But I suggest you conduct your investigation openly, in front of these newspaper reporters, so that the public can judge for themselves whether Morrison Ranch represents a threat to children or a model for how society should treat its most vulnerable." Members, the challenge was brilliant in its simplicity. By inviting public scrutiny, Jake was betting that the evidence would speak for itself and that the American people, when presented with the facts, would support his approach over his opponents. It was a gamble that would soon transform a local dispute into a national debate about the nature of childhood, the obligations of wealth, and the kind of society America wanted to become. The inspection of Morrison Ranch that began the following morning would prove to be one of the most consequential events in the history of American child welfare reform. What Sheriff Blackwood and his consortium of business allies had intended as a quick demolition of Jake Morrison's reputation instead became a 3-day examination that exposed the shocking contrast between Jake's progressive community and the exploitative practices that characterized most of 1887. Texas. The investigation team that assembled at dawn included not only the local officials but also territorial authorities who had been summoned to lend credibility to the proceedings. Most importantly, it included reporters from newspapers in Dallas, Austin, and even New York, drawn by advance word that something unprecedented was unfolding in the East Texas countryside. Samuel Hutchinson of the Dallas Herald proved to be the most perceptive of the journalists, immediately recognizing that he was witnessing either a remarkable experiment in social progress or an elaborate deception that deserved careful scrutiny. His colleague, Margaret O'Sullivan from the New York Tribune, brought the perspective of someone who had covered urban poverty and industrial exploitation, giving her a keen eye for the signs of child mistreatment that the investigators claimed to be seeking. The first stop on their tour was the schoolhouse, where Miss Rebecca Sterling had prepared her students for what she knew would be a crucial test of everything they had built together. The 23 children present represented the full diversity of the ranch community: Anglo, Mexican, and African American children sitting side by side, working from the same textbooks, held to the same academic standards regardless of their family's economic status or ethnic background. Judge Pemberton, who had clearly expected to find evidence of educational neglect or inappropriate indoctrination, instead discovered a classroom that put most urban schools to shame. The children demonstrated reading abilities that exceeded grade-level expectations, mathematical skills that impressed even the skeptical officials, and a breadth of knowledge about history, geography, and science that spoke to the quality of their instruction. "This is highly irregular," Judge Pemberton muttered as he watched 10-year-old Maria Rodriguez, daughter of the head vaquero, recite poetry in both English and Spanish with equal fluency. Mixing children of different backgrounds in this manner could lead to social confusion and unrealistic expectations about their future prospects. Margaret O'Sullivan scribbled furiously in her notebook, recognizing that she was witnessing an early experiment in integrated education that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial and class boundaries. "Miss Sterling," she asked, "what results have you observed from teaching children of different backgrounds together?" The young teacher's answer would be quoted in newspapers across America within the week. "I've observed that children judge each other based on character and ability, rather than the circumstances of their birth when they're given the opportunity to do so. They form friendships across lines that adults consider unbridgeable, and they challenge each other to achieve more than any of them might accomplish in isolation." The medical examination conducted by Dr. Harrison, in full view of the visiting officials, dealt a devastating blow to Dr. Thornfield's implied accusations of mistreatment. The 3 Whitfield sisters, along with a dozen other children randomly selected for examination, showed clear evidence of excellent health care and proper nutrition. Sarah had gained 15 pounds since her arrival. Katie's chronic cough had disappeared, and Ellie's psychological recovery was evident in her bright eyes and easy laughter. Dr. Thornfield, Samuel Hutchinson asked pointedly, given the evidence before us, do you maintain your concerns about the medical care these children are receiving? Dr. Thornfield's response revealed the political nature of his accusations. Rather than addressing the medical evidence, he shifted to ideological arguments about the dangers of exposing children to unconventional social arrangements that might undermine their respect for traditional authority structures. But it was the visit to the workshop facilities that provided the most dramatic revelation of the investigation. Here, teenage boys from ranch families learned trades that would serve them throughout their lives: blacksmithing, carpentry, leatherworking, and mechanical repair. More shocking to the investigating officials was the presence of girls learning these same skills, alongside traditionally feminine accomplishments like sewing and cooking. 16-year-old Rebecca Morales, whose parents had fled Mexico seeking better opportunities for their children, was operating a printing press that produced everything from ranch correspondence to educational materials for the school. Her technical expertise and business knowledge impressed even the skeptical officials, but her presence in what was considered a male profession challenged their fundamental assumptions about appropriate gender roles. Mr. Morrison, Sheriff Blackwood, demanded, "Don't you believe that teaching girls mechanical skills fills their heads with inappropriate ambitions that will make them unsuitable for marriage and motherhood?" Jake's response cut to the heart of his educational philosophy. "Sheriff, I believe that teaching any child skills that might help them support themselves and contribute to society serves everyone's interests. A woman who can operate a printing press or repair machinery has options that protect her from the kind of desperation that forces people into unfortunate circumstances." The implications of this statement weren't lost on the female reporter, Margaret O'Sullivan, who recognized that Jake was describing an alternative to the economic dependence that trapped most women in unsatisfactory marriages or forced them into prostitution when other options failed. The second day of the investigation brought an unexpected development that would transform the entire proceeding. A wagon arrived carrying three figures who would prove to be game changers: Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield, the mother of Thomas Whitfield and grandmother to Sarah, Katie, and Ellie; Reverend Joshua McKenna, a Methodist minister who had known the Whitfield family for years; and most shocking of all, William Patterson III, son of Jake's childhood benefactor and now a prominent attorney from Austin. Mrs. Whitfield, a dignified woman in her 70s who had been traveling from Arkansas when she learned of her son's death and her granddaughter's situation, brought with her documents that would shatter the legal foundation of the opposition's case. Among her papers were Thomas Whitfield's hidden records detailing the safety violations that had led to his murder, correspondence proving the mill owner's knowledge of dangerous conditions, and witness statements from workers who had been afraid to speak out until now. Constance Whitfield, Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield announced in a voice that carried moral authority, had no legal right to sell these children. As their only surviving blood relative, custody should have passed to me upon their parents' death. Any contracts she signed were fraudulent from the beginning. This revelation created a legal crisis that threatened to invalidate everything that had transpired since the auction in Marshall. If the adoption contracts were indeed fraudulent, Jake's rescue of the girls might be legally meaningless, leaving them vulnerable to being reclaimed by their grandmother or placed in the custody of territorial authorities. But William Patterson III had come prepared with a solution that would set another unprecedented legal precedent. "Mrs. Whitfield," he addressed the elderly woman formally, "I understand you wish to see your granddaughters cared for properly, but at your age, taking custody of 3 young children would present obvious challenges. Would you consider a legal arrangement that would make Mr. Morrison their official guardian, while recognizing your status as their grandmother and giving you visitation rights? The proposal was revolutionary for its time, a custody arrangement based on the best interests of the children rather than strict legal ownership rights. It would require Mrs. Whitfield to voluntarily surrender legal custody while retaining family status, and it would give Jake legal authority while acknowledging his moral rather than proprietary relationship to the girls. Reverend McKenna's testimony provided crucial moral support for this arrangement. As someone who had known the Whitfield family intimately, he could speak to Thomas and Margaret's values and their likely wishes for their daughter's future. Thomas Whitfield, the minister declared, was a man who believed that children should be educated, protected, and prepared for useful lives regardless of their economic circumstances. From what I've observed here, Mr. Morrison is fulfilling Thomas's wishes for his daughters in ways that their aunt never attempted, and that their poverty would have made impossible in conventional circumstances. The third day of the investigation brought the most dramatic confrontation yet when Marcus Henley, the mill owner whose safety violations had killed the girls' parents, attempted to discredit Mrs. Whitfield's testimony by questioning her mental competence. This attack on a grieving grandmother proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation that revealed the true character of Jake's opponents. "Mrs. Whitfield," Henley said with barely concealed contempt, "isn't it true that grief over your son's death has clouded your judgment? Isn't it possible that you're being manipulated by people who want to use these tragic circumstances for their own political purposes?" The elderly woman's response demonstrated the steel backbone that had been passed down through generations of Whitfield women. "Mr. Henley," she said with quiet dignity, "my son died because you valued profit more than human life. My granddaughters nearly faced lives of exploitation because people like you see children as sources of cheap labor rather than precious souls deserving of protection. If recognizing that truth makes me incompetent, then I'm proud of my incompetence." Sarah Whitfield, who had been watching this exchange with growing anger, chose that moment to deliver testimony that would be remembered as one of the most powerful statements ever made by a child in an American legal proceeding. "Mr. Henley," she said, rising from her seat with the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose, "you killed my parents as surely as if you had shot them. You knew that equipment was dangerous, you knew workers were dying, and you chose to keep it secret because fixing it would cost money. Now you want to destroy the man who saved us from the consequences of your greed, because his kindness makes your cruelty look even worse than it is." The courtroom, for that's what the ranch's community hall had effectively become, fell into complete silence as a 14-year-old orphan girl spoke truth to power with a clarity and courage that shamed the adults who had failed to protect her family. Margaret O'Sullivan, scribbling frantically to capture every word, would later write that Sarah Whitfield's testimony marked the moment when American public opinion shifted decisively in favor of child welfare reform. Here was living proof that children were capable of understanding their own interests, articulating their needs, and defending themselves when given the opportunity to do so. The investigation that was supposed to destroy Jake Morrison's reputation instead became the catalyst for a national movement that would transform how America treated its most vulnerable citizens. By the time the officials departed Morrison Ranch, they carried with them not evidence of wrongdoing, but documentation of an alternative approach to child welfare that challenged everything their society had accepted as normal and necessary. The reports that appeared in newspapers across the country in the following weeks would spark congressional hearings, inspire social reform movements, and ultimately lead to legislation protecting orphaned children from exploitation. But more immediately, they would bring to Morrison Ranch a stream of visitors seeking to understand how one man's simple act of kindness had grown into something that threatened to revolutionize American society. The transformation began with a single newspaper article, but it spread across America like wildfire in dry grass. Margaret O'Sullivan's front-page story in the New York Tribune titled The Texas Rancher Who Treats Children Like Human Beings, appeared on November 15, 1887, and within hours, telegraph operators across the nation were overwhelmed with requests. For more information about Morrison Ranch and the revolutionary experiment taking place there, the article's impact was immediate and unprecedented. Within a week, Jake Morrison found himself receiving letters from as far away as Boston and San Francisco, some praising his work, others condemning it, but all acknowledging that something significant was happening in the East Texas countryside that demanded national attention. Among the first visitors to arrive were representatives from the Children's Aid Society of New York, led by a formidable woman named Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell, whose 20 years of experience in urban child welfare had convinced her that traditional orphanages were little more than warehouses for unwanted children. She came to Morrison Ranch expecting to find either a remarkable innovation or an elaborate fraud, but she was unprepared for what she actually discovered. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Caldwell announced during their first meeting in his study, "I have visited children's institutions in every major city in America, and I have never seen anything that approaches what you've created here. These children aren't just housed and fed. They're being prepared for meaningful lives as productive citizens." Her week-long evaluation of the ranch's programs would result in a detailed report that circulated among social reformers throughout the Northeast, providing a blueprint for alternative approaches to child welfare that challenged the institutional model that had dominated American practice for decades. But it was the unexpected arrival of a congressional delegation that truly signaled the national significance of what was unfolding at Morrison Ranch. Senator Charles Whitmore of Massachusetts, chairman of the Senate Committee on Labor and Education, had read O'Sullivan's article with the growing conviction that the practices it described might offer solutions to problems that were plaguing industrial cities throughout America. The delegation that accompanied Senator Whitmore included representatives from both political parties, reflecting the bipartisan recognition that child welfare had become a national crisis requiring federal attention. Among them was Congressman Daniel Harrison of Illinois, whose own childhood experiences in Chicago's industrial districts had made him a passionate advocate for protective legislation. "Gentlemen," Senator Whitmore addressed Jake and his assembled staff during their first formal meeting, "we're here because Congress is considering legislation that would establish federal standards for the treatment of orphaned and dependent children. Your ranch has been cited as evidence that alternative approaches to child welfare might be more effective than our current institutional systems." The implications of federal interest were staggering. If Morrison Ranch could serve as a model for national policy, it might transform the lives of hundreds of thousands of children who were currently trapped in systems that prioritize custody over care, control over development. Jake's response revealed the depth of thought he had given to the broader implications of his work. "Senator, what we've done here isn't complicated or expensive. We've simply treated children as if their futures matter, as if their potential is worth investing in, as if their opinions deserve consideration. The remarkable thing isn't that it works. The remarkable thing is that so few people have tried it." Over the following days, the congressional delegation conducted their own investigation. But unlike the hostile inquiry led by Sheriff Blackwood, this examination was designed to understand rather than undermine. The senators and congressmen interviewed children, teachers, parents, and community leaders, gathering testimony that would form the foundation for landmark federal legislation. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Katie Whitfield, now flourishing in Elena's kitchen and showing remarkable business acumen as she helped manage the ranch's food supplies. When Congressman Harrison asked her what advice she would give to other orphan children, her answer captured the essence of everything Jake had built. "I would tell them," Katie said with the confidence of someone who had discovered her own worth, "that being an orphan doesn't mean you have to settle for whatever scraps adults are willing to give you. It means you have to work harder to prove what you're capable of. But if you find the right people to help you, you can become anything you want to be. The congressional hearings that followed in Washington would ultimately lead to the passage of the Federal Child Protection Act of 1888, the first comprehensive legislation establishing national standards for child welfare. But the immediate impact of the federal attention was to bring Morrison Ranch to the attention of wealthy philanthropists who had been seeking effective ways to address social problems. Andrew Carnegie himself arrived in December 1887, accompanied by an entourage that included his personal secretary, a team of efficiency experts, and a photographer whose images would document every aspect of the ranch's operations. Carnegie's interest wasn't purely philanthropic. He was exploring whether Jake's model could be scaled up and replicated in industrial communities where his own business interests required stable, educated workforces. Morrison, Carnegie said, during their private meeting, "What you've accomplished here represents the kind of social investment that smart businessmen should be making everywhere. Educated, healthy workers are more productive, more loyal, and more innovative than exploited ones. Your ranch proves that treating people well isn't just morally right, it's economically smart." Carnegie's endorsement opened doors that Jake had never imagined. Within months, he found himself consulting on similar projects in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and California, helping wealthy industrialists establish communities that prioritized human development over pure profit extraction. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected quarter. The children themselves began to achieve successes that silenced even the most vocal critics of Jake's methods. Sarah Whitfield, now 16 and having completed coursework that would normally require graduation from a prestigious Eastern academy, received acceptance letters from 3 universities, including Radcliffe College, making her one of the first orphaned children in American history to qualify for higher education. Her acceptance speech at the ranch's first formal graduation ceremony in May 1888 would be reprinted in newspapers across the country and quoted by social reformers for decades to come. 2 years ago, Sarah said, standing before an audience that included territorial officials, federal representatives, and journalists from around the nation, I stood on an auction block waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Today, I stand here as proof that every child deserves the chance to discover what they're capable of achieving when they're treated with dignity and given real opportunities for growth. Katie's success was equally remarkable, though it took a different form. Her natural talent for cooking and business management had led to her appointment as manager of the ranch's food services at age 14, a position that required her to oversee budgets, manage suppliers, and coordinate meals for nearly 300 people. Her innovations in food preservation and preparation were being studied by hotel managers and institutional kitchens throughout Texas. Even little Ellie, now 10 years old and fully recovered from the trauma that had once left her nearly mute, had found her calling as an assistant teacher in the ranch's school. Her natural ability to connect with younger children and her patience with those who struggled academically made her invaluable to Miss Sterling's expanding educational program. The 3 sisters had become living advertisements for Jake's philosophy that children's potential should never be limited by the circumstances of their birth. Their success inspired other wealthy individuals to attempt similar experiments, leading to the establishment of progressive communities in Arizona, Colorado, and even as far away as Oregon. But perhaps the most important development was the network of communication that began to develop between children at Morrison Ranch and orphans in traditional institutions throughout America. Letters poured in from youngsters who had heard about the Texas ranch where children were treated as family members rather than burdens, where education was a right rather than a privilege, where futures were planned rather than merely endured. These letters, many of which Jake shared with visiting reformers and government officials, provided heartbreaking testimony about conditions in conventional orphanages and industrial schools. They described lives of constant hunger, physical punishment for minor infractions, educational programs designed to prepare children for nothing more than menial labor, and systematic crushing of any ambitions that extended beyond their expected. Social Station. One letter from a 15-year-old boy in a New York orphanage captured the desperation that drove children to seek alternatives. Dear Mr. Morrison, I heard about your ranch from a teacher who read about it in the newspaper. I can read and write, and I'm good with numbers, but they tell me I should be grateful for the chance to work in a factory when I turn 16. Is it really true that some places let children dream about being more than what other people expect them to be? These letters convinced Jake that Morrison Ranch needed to expand beyond its original mission of caring for a few orphaned children. Working with Mrs. Caldwell and other reformers, he began developing plans for a national network of progressive children's communities that could serve as alternatives to the institutional systems that were failing so many young Americans. Announcement of this expansion plan, made during a speech at the Texas state capitol in Austin, marked the moment when Jake Morrison's simple act of kindness at a rural auction transformed into a national movement that would reshape American attitudes toward childhood, education, and the obligations of wealth toward society's most vulnerable members. What we've learned at Morrison Ranch, Jake told the assembled legislators and reformers, is that children are not raw materials to be processed into whatever adults find useful. They are individuals with their own talents, dreams, and potential. Contributions to society. Our job is not to break them into compliance, but to provide them with the tools and opportunities they need to build meaningful lives. The speech was interrupted by applause 17 times and received coverage in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. More importantly, it inspired the passage of state legislation that would regulate child labor, improve conditions in existing orphanages, and provide funding for experimental programs based on the Morrison Ranch model. By the end of 1888, less than 2 years after Jake had disrupted a human auction in the small town of Marshall, his simple act of compassion had grown into something that was reshaping American society. The 3 frightened girls he had rescued from exploitation had become symbols of what was possible when children were treated with dignity and given real opportunities for growth. But the greatest transformation was still to come, as the success of Morrison Ranch inspired a generation of reformers, philanthropists, and ordinary citizens to reconsider their assumptions about childhood, education, and the kind of society America could become if it truly committed to protecting and nurturing its most vulnerable members. Success. Jake Morrison learned in the spring of 1889, breeds enemies more dangerous than poverty ever could. As Morrison Ranch became a symbol of progressive child welfare and inspired similar projects across America, powerful forces began organizing a systematic campaign to destroy not just Jake's reputation, but the entire movement he had accidentally created. The counterattack began in the boardrooms of major corporations whose business models depended on cheap child labor. Factory owners from Massachusetts to California had watched with growing alarm as stories about Morrison Ranch sparked public discussions about children's rights, educational opportunities, and the morality of industrial practices that treated young workers as expendable resources. Leading this corporate resistance was industrialist Harrison Blackstone, owner of textile mills in 5 states and a man whose fortune had been built on the labor of children as young as 8 years old. Blackstone understood better than most that Jake Morrison's philosophy posed an existential threat to an economic system that had made many Americans wealthy through the systematic exploitation of the powerless. Gentlemen, Blackstone addressed a secret gathering of business leaders in Chicago, what's happening in Texas represents more than misguided charity. It's a direct attack on the principles of free enterprise that have made America prosperous. If we allow sentimental notions about children's rights to dictate business practices, will destroy the competitive advantages that have built our industrial economy. The strategy that emerged from this meeting was sophisticated and ruthless. Rather than attacking Jake Morrison directly, a approach that had backfired spectacularly for Sheriff Blackwood and his allies, they would undermine the moral and legal foundations of his work through a carefully orchestrated campaign of character assassination, legal challenges, and political pressure. The first phase of their attack targeted Jake's financial resources. Banking partners who had previously been eager to do business with Morrison Ranch suddenly discovered technical violations in loan agreements. Suppliers who had provided goods and services for years began demanding payment in advance, citing concerns about the ranch's experimental nature. Railroad companies that had offered preferential shipping rates for Morrison cattle mysteriously revoked their agreements, claiming new corporate policies prohibited special arrangements with unconventional enterprises. The financial pressure was designed to force Jake into impossible choices: abandon his expensive educational and social programs to maintain profitability, or face bankruptcy that would destroy everything he had built. It was economic warfare disguised as normal business operations, and it might have succeeded if Jake hadn't anticipated such tactics and prepared accordingly. Working with William Patterson III and other allies, Jake had quietly restructured Morrison Ranch's finances to make it less vulnerable to coordinated economic attacks. Diversified banking relationships, supply contracts with multiple vendors, and partnerships with reform-minded businessmen provided buffers against the kind of pressure that had destroyed other progressive enterprises. But the real danger came from a different direction entirely. Dr. Ezra Thornfield, the physician whose medical opinions had been discredited during the original investigation, had spent months developing what he claimed was scientific evidence that Jake's educational methods were psychologically harmful to children. Working with like-minded colleagues, he produced a series of papers arguing that exposure to inappropriate intellectual stimulation could damage young minds and create unrealistic expectations that would lead to mental illness and social disruption. These pseudoscientific arguments found receptive audiences among conservative religious leaders who viewed Jake's integrated community and progressive educational methods as threats to traditional social hierarchies. Reverend Cornelius Blackthorne, a prominent Methodist minister from Dallas, began preaching sermons that described Morrison Ranch as a den of heretical thinking, where children were being corrupted by radical ideas that undermined parental authority and Christian values. Brothers and sisters, Blackthorne thundered from pulpits across Texas, we are witnessing a systematic attack on the God-ordained relationships that hold our society together. When children are taught to question authority, to aspire beyond their proper stations, to mix freely with those of different races and backgrounds, we invite chaos and moral decay into our communities. The religious opposition proved particularly effective because it wrapped economic interests in moral language that resonated with ordinary citizens who might otherwise support child welfare reform. Church congregations that had never questioned the morality of child labor were suddenly convinced that protecting children from exploitation was somehow contrary to divine will. The legal assault that followed was even more dangerous. Teams of lawyers hired by the Industrial Consortium began filing challenges to the legal arrangements that allowed Morrison Ranch to operate. They questioned the validity of the custody agreements that made Jake guardian of the Whitfield sisters, challenged the ranch's tax-exempt status as an educational institution, and demanded investigations into compliance with territorial regulations governing children's institutions. That most seriously, they convinced a federal judge to issue an injunction that temporarily suspended Jake's authority to accept new orphaned children pending a comprehensive review of his qualifications and methods. The injunction, based on Dr. Thornfield's discredited research and Reverend Blackthorne's moral objections, effectively shut down the expansion program that had been planned to help thousands of children across America. The legal and financial Pressures were accompanied by a campaign of personal vilification that targeted not just Jake but everyone associated with Morrison Ranch. Anonymous pamphlets circulated throughout East Texas, spreading rumors about improper relationships between staff members, financial corruption, and even suggestions that the ranch was being used as a base for foreign political activities. Elena Rodriguez found herself subjected to particularly vicious attacks that combined racism with accusations of moral impropriety. Anonymous letters warned that she was corrupting innocent children with foreign influences and suggested that her presence in the community represented a threat to American values. The stress of these attacks began to affect her health and her relationship with her own family, who worried about the consequences of their association with Morrison Ranch. Miss Rebecca Sterling faced similar pressure from educational authorities, who questioned her teaching methods and suggested that her emphasis on critical thinking and intellectual independence was inappropriate for children from lower-class backgrounds. Several school districts that had been considering adopting Morrison Ranch's educational innovations canceled their plans, citing concerns about public reaction to radical pedagogical experiments. The campaign reached its climax when Sarah Whitfield, now 18 and preparing to leave for Radcliffe College, was approached by representatives claiming to offer her a better opportunity for education if she would publicly renounce her support for Jake Morrison and describe her experiences at the ranch as harmful rather than beneficial. The offer came from a consortium of Eastern educational institutions that had been pressured by wealthy donors to distance themselves from the Morrison Ranch model. They promised Sarah full scholarships, guaranteed graduate school placement, and future career opportunities, all in exchange for testimony that would support the narrative that Jake's methods were experimental and potentially damaging. Miss Whitfield, the lead representative, explained during a private meeting, "You have remarkable potential that shouldn't be wasted on misguided loyalty to a man whose ideas have been discredited by serious experts. We're offering you the chance to have a real future, free from the stigma of association with this failed experiment." Sarah's response revealed the depth of character that her years at Morrison Ranch had helped develop. "Gentlemen," she said, with the quiet dignity that had impressed congressional investigators, "Mr. Morrison gave me something more valuable than any scholarship or career opportunity you could offer. He gave me the knowledge that I have the right to make my own choices about my future, and I choose to remain loyal to the man who treated me as a human being when the rest of society was willing to let me be sold like livestock." Her rejection of their offer marked the beginning of a counteroffensive that would ultimately expose the true nature of the forces arrayed against Morrison Ranch. Working with Margaret O'Sullivan and other sympathetic journalists, Sarah began documenting the systematic campaign of intimidation and economic pressure that was being directed against Jake and his community. The evidence she gathered revealed connections between the industrial consortium, the religious opposition, and the legal challenges that painted a clear picture of coordinated effort to destroy Morrison Ranch before its example could inspire broader social change. Corporate executives who publicly claimed to support child welfare were privately funding efforts to discredit the most successful child welfare program in American history. Most damning of all was the discovery of correspondence between Harrison Blackstone and Dr. Thornfield that revealed the financial arrangements behind the supposedly scientific research that had been used to justify legal action against the ranch. The medical evidence that children were being harmed by educational opportunities had been purchased with corporate money and tailored to support predetermined conclusions. The exposure of these corrupt practices created a scandal that reverberated throughout American society. Newspapers that had been skeptical of Morrison Ranch were forced to acknowledge that the attacks against it were motivated by greed rather than legitimate concern for children's welfare. Religious leaders who had supported the moral crusade against Jake's work found themselves embarrassed by revelations about the financial interests behind their theological arguments, but perhaps most importantly, The attempted destruction of Morrison Ranch inspired a grassroots movement of ordinary citizens who recognized that the same forces threatening Jake's community also threatened their own hopes for their children's futures. Parents who had remained silent about exploitative working conditions, teachers who had been afraid to advocate for better educational resources, and community leaders who had accepted inequality as inevitable began to organize resistance to the economic and political systems that prioritized profits over human welfare. The battle for Morrison Ranch had become a battle for the soul of American society, and the outcome would determine whether the nation's ideals of equality and opportunity would remain empty promises or become living realities for millions of children who deserved better than the exploitation and neglect that had characterized their treatment throughout American history. As spring turned to summer in 1889, Jake Morrison found himself at the center of a conflict that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined when he disrupted a simple auction in Marshall less than 3 years earlier. The 3 frightened girls he had rescued had become symbols in a national struggle between 2 visions of what America could become, one based on exploitation and the other on the radical idea that every child deserved the chance to discover their own potential. The final confrontation was approaching, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of Morrison Ranch, but the future of childhood in America. The summer of 1889 brought an unexpected twist to the battle over Morrison Ranch that would forever change how America viewed children's rights and capabilities. What began as an adult conflict over economic and social policies suddenly became something unprecedented in American history. A coordinated movement led by children themselves, demanding the right to determine their own futures. The catalyst was a letter that arrived at Morrison Ranch on July 4, 1889, Independence Day, as historians would later note with appreciation for the symbolic timing. The letter came from the Riverside Industrial School in Massachusetts, written secretly by a group of children who had learned about the legal attacks on Morrison Ranch through smuggled newspaper clippings. Dear Mr. Morrison and Miss Sarah, the letter began, written in careful script that spoke of education received despite rather than because of institutional policies. We are 12 children between the ages of 11 and 16 who have been following the stories about your ranch in newspapers that some of the older boys steal from the town. We want you to know that there are hundreds of us here who dream every night about places where children are treated like human beings instead of factory equipment. The letter went on to describe conditions at the industrial school that were horrifying even by the standards of 1889. Children working 16-hour days in dangerous textile machinery, educational programs that consisted entirely of learning to read industrial manuals, punishment cells where children were isolated for days for infractions as minor as speaking during work hours, and a mortality rate that would have shocked even the most callous observers. But what makes us write to you, the letter continued, is that they tell us these conditions are for our own good, that we should be grateful for the chance to learn useful work, that dreaming of anything better is ungrateful and sinful. We want to tell the world that this is a lie. We want adults to know that children can tell the difference between kindness and cruelty, between education and exploitation, between hope and despair. Jake read this letter aloud to Sarah, Katie, and Ellie during one of their regular family dinners, watching as their faces reflected horror at the described conditions and determination to help their fellow children. What happened next would demonstrate how thoroughly Morrison Ranch had prepared its young residents for meaningful civic engagement. We have to do something, Sarah announced immediately. These children are facing exactly what we would have faced if you hadn't rescued us. Mr. Morrison, we can't just read their letter and do nothing. Katie, now 16 and running the ranch's increasingly complex food services operation, was already thinking practically about logistics. How many children are we talking about? Not just at that school, but at all the places like it. And what kind of help do they actually need? 11-year-old Ellie, whose recovery from trauma had transformed her into a confident young advocate for other vulnerable children. Ask the question that would reshape their entire approach. Why are we talking about helping them? Why aren't we talking about helping them help themselves? The distinction was crucial. Traditional charitable approaches focused on rescuing individual children from bad situations, but Ellie was suggesting something far more radical, empowering children to advocate for systemic changes that would improve conditions for all vulnerable young people. Working with William Patterson III, who had become not just Jake's attorney, but a passionate advocate for child welfare reform, they developed a strategy that was unprecedented in American legal and social history. They would organize a coordinated effort by children themselves to document conditions in industrial schools, orphanages, and factories throughout the country, gathering evidence that could be used to support federal legislation protecting children's rights. The plan was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in American reform movements. Children at Morrison Ranch would serve as coordinators, reaching out to young people in institutions across the country through a network of sympathetic teachers, reform-minded religious leaders, and progressive journalists. These children would document their experiences through letters, drawings, and testimonies that would be compiled into a comprehensive report on child welfare conditions nationwide. Most importantly, the children themselves would present this evidence to Congress, speaking directly to lawmakers about their experiences and needs, rather than having adults speak for them. It was a radical departure from the paternalistic approach that had characterized all previous child welfare efforts. The response to their call for documentation was overwhelming. Within weeks of sending out their initial letters through various channels, Morrison Ranch was receiving correspondence from children in every state and territory. The stories they told painted a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation that was far worse than even the most committed reformers had imagined. From a coal mine in Pennsylvania came testimony from boys as young as 10 who worked in conditions so dangerous that fatal accidents occurred weekly. From a cotton mill in South Carolina came letters describing children who had lost fingers or hands to machinery and were then discarded as useless by their employers. From an orphanage in California came accounts of children being hired out to families who treated them as unpaid servants and subjected them to physical and sexual abuse. But perhaps most significantly, the letters revealed that children had clear, sophisticated understandings of their rights and needs. Far from being passive victims who required adult protection, they were thoughtful analysts of their own situations who could articulate specific policy changes that would improve their lives. A 14-year-old girl from a New York garment factory wrote, "People think children don't understand business, but we understand perfectly. We understand that our labor makes other people rich while we stay poor and ignorant. We understand that the machines we operate could be made safer if owners wanted to spend the money. We understand that we could learn real skills instead of just repetitive tasks if anyone cared about our futures instead of just our immediate usefulness." A 12-year-old boy from a Chicago foundry added, "Adults always talk about what's best for children, but they never ask children what we think is best for ourselves. We know when we're being treated fairly and when we're being exploited. We know the difference between education that prepares us for better lives and training that just makes us more valuable to employers who don't care about us as people." As the documentation project continued, Sarah Whitfield emerged as the natural leader of what newspapers began calling the Children's Crusade. Her combination of intelligence, education, and personal experience, with both exploitation and opportunity, made her an eloquent spokesperson for the movement. More importantly, her age, now 18 and legally an adult, allowed her to speak with authority that younger children might not have been granted in formal settings. Working with Margaret O'Sullivan and other sympathetic journalists, Sarah began publishing articles in major newspapers that presented the children's evidence to the American public. Her writing combined the moral clarity of someone who had experienced injustice with the analytical skills that her education at Morrison Ranch had developed. "The question facing America," Sarah wrote in a piece that appeared simultaneously in newspapers across the country, "is not whether we can afford to treat children humanely, but whether we can afford to continue brutalizing the citizens who will determine our nation's future. Every child forced into dangerous labor, denied education, or treated as property rather than as a person represents a loss of human potential that diminishes us all." The children's movement gained powerful adult allies who had been waiting for exactly this kind of grassroots advocacy to support their own reform efforts. Frances Willard, leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, recognized that child welfare reform was naturally connected to women's rights issues. Samuel Gompers, head of the American Federation of Labor, understood that child labor exploitation undermined adult workers' ability to demand fair wages and working conditions. Most significantly, the children's advocacy caught the attention of President Benjamin Harrison himself, who had been elected partly on promises to address the social problems created by rapid industrialization. In August 1889, President Harrison issued an unprecedented invitation. Representatives of the Children's Crusade would be welcomed at the White House to present their findings directly to the federal government. The delegation that traveled to Washington in September 1889 included Sarah Whitfield as chief spokesperson, along with 12 other young people from various parts of the country who had emerged as leaders in documenting child welfare abuses. They ranged in age from 11 to 17, represented different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and brought with them a comprehensive report documenting conditions affecting more than 100,000 children nationwide. The White House meeting lasted 3 hours and was attended not only by President Harrison but by key congressional leaders, cabinet officials, and representatives from major newspapers. What transpired in that room would be remembered as one of the most remarkable presentations in American political history. Sarah's opening statement set the tone for everything that followed. "Mr. President, we come before you not as children, seeking charity, but as future citizens demanding justice. We represent thousands of young Americans who are being denied the opportunity to become the productive, educated, contributing members of society that our nation needs us to become." The specific testimonies that followed were devastating in their clarity and impact. 11-year-old Marcus Johnson, who had escaped from a Georgia textile mill, displayed hands that had been permanently damaged by machinery and explained how industrial accidents were covered up to avoid liability. 15-year-old Maria Santos described the systematic educational neglect in institutions that claimed to prepare children for useful lives but actually ensured they would remain trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. Perhaps most powerfully, 13-year-old Timothy Walsh from a Chicago industrial school presented detailed proposals for federal legislation that would establish minimum age requirements for dangerous work, mandate educational opportunities for all children, regardless of their economic circumstances, and create federal oversight of institutions claiming to care for orphaned or dependent children. These are not naive dreams of children who don't understand the real world, Timothy explained to the assembled officials. These are practical solutions developed by young people who understand exactly how the real world works, because we've been forced to live in its harshest realities since we were old enough to be useful to adults who profit from our labor. President Harrison's response marked a turning point in American attitudes toward children's rights and capabilities. "Young people," he said formally, "you have presented evidence and arguments that would be impressive coming from adults with decades of experience in law and policy. Coming from children who have lived through the conditions you describe, they are absolutely compelling. You have my commitment that this administration will work with Congress to address the injustices you have documented." The White House meeting concluded with the announcement that federal hearings on child welfare reform would begin immediately. with the children's documentation serving as primary evidence and young people themselves testifying as expert witnesses on their own experiences. As the delegation prepared to return to their various communities, Sarah Whitfield reflected on how far they had all come from the frightened, powerless children they had been just 2 years earlier. The auction block where she had once waited to be sold to the highest bidder seemed like a memory from another lifetime, replaced by images of herself addressing the President of the United States as an equal participant in shaping America's future. The Children's Crusade had achieved something unprecedented in American history. It had given young people a voice in determining their own futures and had forced adult society to confront the consequences of treating children as property rather than as human beings with rights, needs, and valuable contributions to make to society. 10 years had passed since Jake Morrison paid $1,000 to free 3 orphan girls from an auction block, and the America of 1897 was fundamentally transformed from the nation that had once accepted child slavery as normal business practice. The Federal Child Protection Act had been law for nearly a decade. Industrial schools across the country operated under strict government oversight, and most remarkably, children's voices were now considered essential in any policy discussions affecting their welfare. But the true measure of what Jake Morrison had built wasn't found in legislation or institutional reforms. It was found in the lives of the thousands of young people who had passed through what had become known nationwide as the Morrison model, and in the revolutionary concept that would shock America more than anything else. Jake Morrison was giving it all away. The announcement came on a crisp December morning in 1897 during the annual Morrison Ranch celebration that had become a pilgrimage site for reformers, educators, and government officials from around the world. Standing before an audience of more than 2,000 people, including reporters from newspapers in 12 countries, Jake Morrison revealed the most audacious plan in American philanthropic history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, "10 years ago, I made what seemed like a simple business transaction. I bought 3 children's freedom because I couldn't stand to see them sold into slavery. Today, I want to announce that those 3 children, now 3 remarkable young women, are about to receive ownership of everything you see around you." The gasps from the crowd were audible even in the back rows. Jake Morrison, whose personal wealth was estimated at over $2 million, was transferring complete ownership of Morrison Ranch, its revolutionary educational systems, its network of affiliated institutions, and its accumulated resources to Sarah, Katie, and Ellie Whitfield. Sarah, now 24 and having graduated with highest honors from Radcliffe College before returning to Texas to help manage the ranch's expanding operations, stepped forward to address the stunned audience. Her transformation from the terrified 14-year-old who had once faced sale at auction to the confident young woman who now commanded international respect was perhaps the most visible symbol of what Morrison Ranch had accomplished. "What Mr. Morrison has given us," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "is more than property or money. He has given us proof that every child deserves the chance to discover what they're capable of achieving when they're treated with dignity and provided with real opportunities for growth." Katie, now 21 and recognized as one of the most innovative food service managers in the American West, added her own perspective. 10 years ago, we were considered worthless 3 orphan girls with no value except as sources of cheap labor. Today, we're being entrusted with resources that will allow us to ensure that other children never face the desperation we once knew. Ellie, the youngest at 18 but already established as a pioneering educator whose teaching methods were being studied at universities throughout the East, completed their joint statement. "We accept this responsibility not as a gift, but as a sacred trust. Every dollar, every resource, every opportunity we've been given will be used to create more opportunities for children who are still waiting for someone to believe in their potential. The legal documents that formalized this unprecedented transfer of wealth revealed the true scope of what Jake had built over the previous decade. Morrison Ranch had grown into a network of 17 affiliated institutions across 8 states, educating more than 3,000 children annually and employing nearly 500 adults whose own stories often paralleled those of the children they served. But the institutions were only part of Jake's legacy. Working with progressive legislators, sympathetic judges, and reform-minded business leaders, he had helped create an entirely new legal framework for child welfare that recognized children as individuals with rights rather than as property to be controlled by adults. The Morrison Legal Foundation, established in 1892, provided free legal representation for children facing exploitation or abuse. In its first 5 years, the foundation had won more than 400 cases, establishing precedents that protected children's rights to education, safe working conditions, and freedom from physical and sexual abuse. The Morrison Educational Trust had revolutionized teacher training by requiring all educators in affiliated schools to study child development, cultural diversity, and progressive pedagogical methods. The Trust's graduates were now teaching in schools across America, carrying Jake's philosophy that every child deserved individualized attention and respect for their unique potential. Perhaps most remarkably, the Morrison Agricultural Cooperative had demonstrated that ethical business practices could be more profitable than exploitative ones. By treating workers as partners rather than as expendable resources, the cooperative had achieved productivity levels that exceeded those of competitors who relied on cheap labor and dangerous working conditions. The success of these various enterprises had created a business model that other entrepreneurs were beginning to adopt, not out of charity, but because treating people well produced better economic results than exploiting them. Jake Morrison had proven that doing good could indeed be good business, inspiring a generation of ethical entrepreneurs who would reshape American capitalism. But the aspect of Jake's legacy that truly shocked America was revealed in the final details of the ownership transfer. Not only were the 3 Whitfield sisters receiving control of Morrison Ranch and its affiliated institutions, they were also inheriting Jake's revolutionary plan for the future of American child welfare. The Morrison Perpetual Trust, established with an initial endowment of $1.5 million, would provide funding in perpetuity for the establishment of new progressive children's institutions. The Trust's governing board would always be composed entirely of people who had themselves been rescued from exploitation as children, ensuring that the perspectives of those who had experienced injustice would guide future reform efforts. Trust charter included provisions that seemed almost fantastical to observers in 1897, but would prove prophetic of social developments in the 20th century. It called for the establishment of public kindergartens in every American community, federal funding for higher education regardless of family income, and government-provided health care for all children, ideas that were considered impossibly radical in the 1890s, but would become accepted policy within decades. Most shocking of all was the Trust's commitment to international child welfare work. Jake Morrison, who had started by rescuing 3 children from a rural Texas auction, had created an organization that would eventually operate schools, orphanages, and advocacy programs in 17 countries, spreading the Morrison model of child-centered education and care across the globe. The ceremony concluding the ownership transfer took place in the same community hall where congressional investigators had once tried to find evidence of wrongdoing at Morrison Ranch. Now that humble building hosted an event that would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in American social reform history. Jake Morrison, now 54 and graying at the temples, but still possessing the quiet strength that had characterized his rescue of the Whitfield sisters, delivered his final address as owner of the institution he had built. When I stood in that auction house 10 years ago, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I saw 3 children who reminded me of my own childhood desperation. I acted from instinct, not from any grand plan to change the world. But those 3 children taught me that individual acts of kindness, when grounded in genuine respect for human dignity, can grow into movements that transform entire societies. He paused, looking out at an audience that included former President Benjamin Harrison, Andrew Carnegie, Francis Willard, and dozens of other national figures who had come to witness this historic moment. What we've built here isn't really mine to give away, because it was never truly mine in the first place. It belongs to every child who has been denied opportunities because of their circumstances, to every adult who remembers what it felt like to be powerless and vulnerable, to everyone who believes that a society should be judged by how it treats its most defenseless members. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but it was interrupted by an unexpected moment that would become part of American folklore. 8-year-old Thomas Rodriguez, son of Elena Rodriguez, and one of the newest students at Morrison Ranch, broke free from the adult supervision and ran directly to Jake Morrison. "Mr. Jake," the boy said in the clear voice that only children possess, "my mama says you're leaving us. But you can't leave us because you taught us that families don't abandon each other when things get hard." Jake knelt down to bring himself to the child's eye level, just as he had done with Sarah, Katie, and Ellie 10 years earlier. "Thomas," he said gently, "I'm not leaving you. I'm giving you something even better than my presence. I'm giving you the knowledge that you have the power to help other children the way I tried to help you. Someday, when you're grown up, you'll meet children who need help, and you'll remember what you learned here about treating people with kindness and respect." The boy nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by turning to address the assembled crowd himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced with the confidence that Morrison Ranch had taught all its children, "Mr. Jake says we're supposed to help other kids who don't have families. So if anybody here knows any kids who need help, you should tell them about this place, because we know how to make people feel safe and happy." The spontaneous applause that erupted from the crowd confirmed what Jake Morrison had always believed. Children who were treated with respect and given real opportunities for growth would naturally become advocates for other children, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of compassion and reform. As the celebration continued into the evening, with musicians and speakers from around the world sharing their tributes to the Morrison model, Jake Morrison slipped away from the main gathering to visit the simple grave marker that honored William Patterson, the man whose kindness had saved Jake's own life and made everything that followed possible. "Mr. Patterson," Jake said quietly, placing a fresh wreath on the grave, "I think we did it. We proved that kindness isn't weakness, that treating people well isn't naive idealism, that children really can become anything they're capable of becoming when someone believes in them enough to provide real opportunities." The next morning, Jake Morrison departed Morrison Ranch for the last time as its owner, carrying only a small suitcase and a heart full of memories. His destination was California, where reports had reached him of Chinese immigrant children being exploited in conditions that rivaled the worst abuses of the industrial East. At 54, Jake Morrison was beginning a new chapter of his life, but his mission remained unchanged: finding children who needed someone to believe in their potential and working to create opportunities for them to thrive. The 3 Whitfield sisters, now the owners of the most successful child welfare institution in American history, stood together on the porch of the house that had been their first real home, watching the dust cloud from Jake's departing wagon fade into the Texas morning. "Do you think we're ready for this responsibility?" Katie asked, her voice reflecting the magnitude of what they had inherited. "I think," Sarah replied, "that we're as ready as anyone can be to carry on work this important. And if we make mistakes, we have Mr. Morrison's example to guide us and thousands of children depending on us to figure it out." Ellie, who had grown from a traumatized 8-year-old into a confident young woman with revolutionary ideas about education, added the final word. The most important thing Mr. Morrison taught us wasn't about running institutions or managing money. He taught us that every child deserves the chance to discover what they're capable of achieving. As long as we never forget that lesson, we'll be fine. By 1900, the Morrison model had been adopted by child welfare institutions in 42 states and 6 foreign countries. By 1920, former Morrison Ranch students had established progressive schools, orphanages, and advocacy organizations on 4 continents. By 1950, the ideas that had seemed impossibly radical when Jake Morrison paid $1,000 for 3 orphaned girls had become the foundation of modern child welfare practice throughout the democratic world. The auction block where Sarah, Katie, and Ellie Whitfield had once awaited sale to the highest bidder was preserved as a historical monument, bearing a simple plaque that read, "On this spot in September 1887, 3 children's freedom was purchased by a man who understood that every human being deserves the chance to choose their own destiny." What began here changed the world. Jake Morrison had shocked America not by building an empire of wealth or power, but by proving that love, respect, and genuine opportunity could transform society's most vulnerable members into its greatest contributors. In giving everything away to the children he had rescued, he had given America something even more valuable, proof that the nation's highest ideals of equality and opportunity could become living realities for everyone, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.